Welcome to Food Friends, a podcast inspiring home cooks to try new dishes in the kitchen by sharing trusted recipes, tips, and friendship. Hi, I'm Sonya.
And I'm Carrie. We met in Los Angeles over 15 years ago as personal chefs and haven't stopped talking about food since. We're so glad you're here. Hi, Sonya.
Hi, Carrie.
Sonya, today we're going to talk about our pantries, one of my favorite topics.
I think people have a lot of questions like about what to keep on hand and then also how to use it. Sometimes you hear what you should stock your pantry with, and then you're like, but what do I do with this jar of tahini, for instance?
Yeah, and I think, a well-stocked pantry also really can support your cooking, especially if you're running through the grocery store, you just grab a few things. If you know that you have certain things on hand at home, like pasta or grains, or we're going to get into all those things, but I just think that really, if every time you wanted to cook, you had to buy like flour and eggs and salt, and it would just be exhausting.
Yeah, it's nice to have a stock larder. I think we're going to skip over some of the more obvious things and maybe for another time, like the oils and vinegars, the dried beans, some of the, rice, things that both of us have for sure. We're going to focus more on like the highlights of our pantry, like our workhorses. You and I have a lot of overlap, so we'll talk about some of that. And we'll also talk about some differences because I think I stock a few things you don't, and vice versa.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's also, we're not really going to cover spices either, because I
That's
think
true.
what's worth just saying out loud is that if you want to make a recipe with a certain spice, then buy that spice. But this idea that you're just going to like buy all the spices and then like I think that's not a productive way to have a pantry. So it's like, what do you use? How do you make sure that you keep those things on hand? Keep a list going in your kitchen or on your phone, wherever you keep your grocery list, so that if you're getting ready to cook, you already know you have some basics that you can rely on.
So let's get into it because we have a lot to cover. I have to start with tomato paste,
Oh
which
my God, I'm so glad you're starting
I
there.
have to. I think it's just one of the most important ingredients of all time. And I think for many reasons, it adds concentrated flavor with very little substance to it. A can or a tube goes a long way. It adds umami, which we're always looking for, which is that savoriness that makes things like lip smacking and enjoyable. It adds a little bit of acidity, a little sweetness. It rounds out so many things. And I think everyone knows like the classic use of tomato paste and the base of a tomato sauce or tomato like recipes. Italian recipes use a lot of tomato paste, but I use it in so many things. I use it in almost every bean dish I ever make because it keeps it from being bland. It's like that hint of something if you're,
Of sweetness,
of
even.
sweetness.
Yeah.
Yeah. And lentils for sure. There's no pot of lentils I make without a little tomato paste. And another thing I recently discovered that I love with tomato paste is as like a major component of a simple broth. So I recently made this dumpling dish, these Monty, which are lamb dumplings. Have you ever had one of those?
I haven't. No, I'm so curious about this.
Very popular in Turkey and other places. They're sort of Mediterranean, and there's variations on this recipe, but usually they're made with lamb or beef, and they're like little dumplings, and you can even make them with wonton wrappers. You don't even have to make the dumpling dough, but they, especially in Turkey, usually come in kind of a tomatoey broth. So it's not soup, it's not stew, but it's like boiled dumplings that you then like kind of coat with like a brothy sauce.
Oh,
So I
wow.
was making this
Yum.
recipe and it called for like a whole little can of tomato paste, like which I love. Like using up a whole can is so
Yes.
satisfying. And like 4 cups of stock or broth. And that was really the basis of this saucy broth. It was no more than that. I mean, there was like maybe a little garlic and a little paprika, but not much more. And it was a total revelation that like tomato paste and a really good stock or broth could create something so delicious for a simple dumpling.
I think you really were the person who taught me about tomato paste and how to use it and how to caramelize it. And, I certainly have read a lot and cooked with it a lot since you sort of introduced it to me. But I think this idea of having this out of this tiny can comes so much, or this tiny tube can come so much. Tomato sauce as like, marinara or something more of like a bolognese, that I grew up with. And one of the things that I shared recently on my Best Bite was that Alison Roman caramelized shallot pasta. And that uses a whole can of tomato paste too. And it's like it clings to the pasta. It's not saucy like a marinara. It's this like really delicious, concentrated umami bomb of a sauce. And so I don't know. I just think it really is. It's so tiny. It takes up so little space in your pantry, but there's just like endless things you can do with it.
Yeah, and the tubes are great because they last forever in your fridge and then you don't have to worry about how much you're using. The cans, if I have leftover tomato paste, I just freeze it actually. I smooth it out in a layer in a plastic bag or on parchment, and then it kind of is like a flat sheet of tomato paste in the freezer, and I break off whatever I need. So there's lots of ways to store it. It doesn't take up too much space and it adds so much flavor. But I got to hear
Yeah.
but I have to hear what's your go-to top pantry item?
I think my go-to top pantry item is beans, and I think a can of chickpeas is I think chickpeas are the most versatile bean. And it's funny, I am such a pasta and bean kind of person. Like when I have nothing else to cook, like I really make like a bite-sized pasta with a chickpea and a red sauce. And to kind of go back to the tomato paste, like you can do that with tomato paste, but you can also do it with a jar of marinara. And usually what I'm doing is I'm starting with like olive oil and whatever aromatics I have on hand, like onions, garlic, if it's just onions, if it's just garlic. And then if I have any vegetables, I add those to the sauce. Open up a can or a container of chickpeas, rinse them off, dump them into the sauce. And by the time the pasta's cooking, usually I'm using like a rotini or a bow tie or, something that's like a bite size. What I actually love to use also is an orecchiette, which is the ear-shaped pasta, which then like the chickpeas kind of like get cradled in them. And to me, that's like a really great, quick weeknight meal. But I also love a can of chickpeas in, like a curry, like a coconut curry. But one of the other things that I learned kind of recently is that, you can make a salad with chickpeas, but even just something as simple as like olive oil, a vinegar, or a lemon juice, and a little bit of cumin and salt can be the start of like so many different kinds of salads. So you could toss that with greens, you can toss that with grains, you can add whatever herbs you have on hand. You can add other dried spices to that. You can make like we've talked about this before, like a chickpea salad sandwich that is kind of similar to like a tuna sandwich. I just think like there's so many things that you can do with chickpeas.
Yeah, chickpeas are definitely a workhorse in my pantry too. And it's kind of like a get me out of jail free card if I haven't planned dinner, because I know I can roast them. I know I can throw them in a curry. I know I can make a salad with them. Like to your point, I make a mock tuna salad. I also love them for a quick hummus. Like Michael Solomonov of the Zahav restaurant, he has this 5-minute creamy hummus recipe that uses canned chickpeas. He had another version in his Zahav cookbook that's a from dried beans. That's an exceptional hummus, but this one is truly 5 minutes. It's so good. We'll link all of these recipes, and it also made me think of our chickpea episode with Sarah Bond, who every single Friday is sharing chickpea recipes and just constantly reminds me of their versatility in both sweet and savory preparations. And I guess I'm still in the sort of like Italian vein of things because the other pantry staple that I have to have are anchovies. And I actually prefer jars of anchovies to tins. So I'll keep like a glass jar that you keep in your pantry. And then once you open it, you transfer it to your fridge. It can last for months in the fridge, just like it can last in a pantry indefinitely. And anchovies are this thing that are so polarizing and sort of have a bad rap. Although in recent years, I think people are starting to help their cause and they're showing up in more recipes. But just like fish sauce in Asia, anchovies in Italian cooking and Mediterranean cooking are the source of, again, umami, which is always what we're looking for, that great flavor and taste that makes you want to take a second bite, like a natural MSG. And anchovies to me, yes, like they show up in all the places you want them to show up in. Like I'll add them to a Caesar dressing. I'll add them to a base of a tomato sauce where they really shine because they just melt into whatever you're cooking. Nobody knows at all that anchovies are in there. Of course, if you have someone vegan at your table, then don't make them this. But
Yes.
if they eat fish, then you can add it. I have lately been just using them for a simple salad dressing. So, a non creamy salad dressing, which I think is not always how people think of anchovies, but sometimes I like to make my own dressings at home. And sometimes I'm like, okay, Jonathan, my husband, doesn't always like a creamy dressing. That's not always his vibe, but I want that like savoriness. I want something more exciting than just olive oil and vinegar. So I'll take one anchovy from the jar in my fridge. I'll mash it up with a fork or, chop it up with a knife on the cutting board, add it to a bowl, add a little bit of grated or pressed garlic, lemon juice, a touch of maple syrup or some kind of sweetener, and olive oil. And that dressing is so flavorful and does not taste of anchovies.
I mean, I've literally never done that. I really love that idea. And I have to say, I have a lot of friends who love like a full anchovy or many full anchovies like on their Caesar salad. And I am not one of those people. I do feel like I'm kind of on the edge of like I like to put it like it is in that caramelized shallot pasta. I definitely remember in my 20s when this Italian friend of mine was like, "You know what the secret to good red sauce is you put an anchovy in." She goes, "It just disappears." And that's true. Just like even a little mash with a fork or the back of your knife, or once you get it into a sauce, it really just bubbles away. But the thought of putting it into a salad dressing like that is really interesting to me because it is one of those like sort of secret things in your pantry that you can really create something out of nothing, right? And this is like such a simple, like an anchovy, a little bit of garlic, a little bit of maple syrup, olive oil, and what vinegar are you usually putting with it? Like a red wine vinegar
The
or
red wine vinegar works. I'm a big sherry vinegar. Like if we were going to
oh
talk about
yeah.
vinegars, I would talk a lot about sherry vinegar. It's a restaurant hack. Like it feels like
Yeah.
every chef loves sherry vinegar for a reason. It's such a mellow but flavorful one. But yeah,
Hmm.
I think that, and I think it even works in a yogurt dressing. It's just that hit of extra boost of flavor. But you could stick an anchovy in a chili and it would add flavor that you wouldn't notice. It's really like designed for, I think, stews, soups, sauces, braises, dressings, anywhere you can sneak it in.
Yeah, no, I really love that idea. Well, Sonia, I think we also have to talk about like towards the top, and I guess maybe in terms of importance, is like coconut milk. I think
Yes.
a can of coconut milk, I always have at least a couple in my pantry. And again, this is one of my like sort of basic, if I don't know what to cook kind of meals, I usually make some kind of a curry, like a coconut milk curry with whatever vegetables I have on hand, kind of similar to this pasta that I just described, where it's like you start with some oil and some garlic and some onions. And then if I've got ginger, I'll add that, whatever vegetables, coconut milk. You can add, this is a place where I like to add a can of chickpeas as well, especially if I don't have any kind of protein. But I also recently shared this Best Bite that we had. It was like a salmon miso coconut curry that my husband made, who's a very new cook. And just like that richness is so nice. And, it's really just like pop the top off and you've got this like rich, delicious sauce. And, I kind of feel like you can't beat it.
Yeah, coconut milk is a must. I feel safer when there's coconut milk in the house. And I add it to a lot of things, all the things you just mentioned. Like I'm really into a quick weeknight curry, a Thai style curry or an Indian style curry that has coconut milk. I also love to add it to soups, like I know you do. And in fact, I
Hmm.
think there was that recent Substack recipe you shared where you added a whole lemon to this very simple
Yeah.
chicken soup, but you also add a can of coconut milk. And that citrus and the coconut milk is such a classic combination and adds that oomph that I think we're always looking for. I also like to add coconut milk, uh, obviously to smoothies, to overnight oats, to kind of breakfasty elements as well.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because I actually kind of forget those ideas too. We're not like a big smoothie house, but I love that classic pina colada flavor. And so to do, just to have like some pineapple and some coconut and some ice, like that's a really nice afternoon treat.
Yeah, the other thing I think coconut milk in terms of soups, besides the one you mentioned, the ones I always add coconut milk to are a squash soup, the roasted sweet potato soup, which we've also shared a recipe for on our Substack. And I even like coconut milk sometimes in a tomato soup because if I want to keep it dairy free, it
Oh,
could add
yeah.
that creaminess that balances out the acidity of the tomatoes, but without the dairy. It's a little bit of like a sweeter note, but I really like that sweetness. I love coconut and tomato. I think they go so well together.
Yeah, I guess I forget about that combination too, but you're totally right. It's like what it does, I think, is it just rounds out some of those sharper flavors. And even when I think about when I had that idea to add the coconut milk to the chicken and lemon soup, it was like that lemony bitterness was like a little bit too much, but just like one little can of coconut milk just made the whole thing work together. It makes the flavors sing, you know?
Yeah, it really does. And again, chicken, citrus, coconut milk, classic combinations. Love the
Yeah.
idea of the salmon curry that you talked about. And another one that I think won't surprise you that I always, always, always have extra in my pantry is tahini.
Not surprised.
Not surprised. Tahini paste, which is just ground sesame seeds. There's a lot of different brands. I'll say if you haven't liked tahini before, you may have gotten a lesser brand. Some of them are really chalky and stale. And the ones that I know are always good are Sum tahini and Seed and Mill tahini here in the States, which you can order online. I also think the 365 Whole Foods organic tahini is solid, and Eden Foods has a really good tahini. So there are more than one option, and there's a variety of price points. And sometimes you have to play around with wherever you live because tahini is sold differently all over the world. But tahini to me is when I am like, this needs a sauce. What do I do? Tahini is what I reach for because you can make a sauce with just tahini paste and water. And that is a classic sauce throughout the Middle East. But you could also add lemon and garlic to it. Suddenly you have a more exciting tahini sauce. I, as you know, love to add gochujang, Korean red pepper paste, to my tahini. I mix those together with some water, rice vinegar, lemon or lime, some garlic, and then I have a hot pepper, creamy sort of tahini sauce. I've also done like a beet tahini sauce where I add cooked beets and tahini paste, water and lemon in a food processor, whiz that all together, and you get this like magenta, beautiful tahini sauce.
Oh, I've never heard you talk about that. That sounds beautiful.
Yeah, I have a recipe I have a recipe that includes all three versions of this tahini sauce, the beet, the gochujang, and the regular. And yeah, that beet tahini sauce, it's so good on a roasted vegetable or like even with some pita chips that you're kind of just dipping into because it's a little thicker, almost like a dip. And it's so
Yeah.
fun to have something bright pink on the table. It's a little unexpected. And then the last thing I always seem to gravitate towards for tahini is I've been making this soba noodle dish on repeat where I make a really sesame creamy tahini sauce instead of a peanut sauce that you might find with a soba noodle. I'll do tahini paste, sesame oil, water, lemon, or vinegar.
So it has that toasted sesame
It has that
flavor and
toasted
as
sesame
opposed to
flavor.
like a toasty peanut, like a peanut buttery flavor. Wow.
Yeah, and I'll link that recipe too. And then I just, saute some vegetables, boil some soba noodles, toss them all in that sauce. And that's like gluten-free, vegan,
Oh my
incredibly protein
gosh.
rich, keeps really well in the fridge. I can have it for lunch the next day. It's such a go-to dish in our house.
Yeah, I mean, I this is another one of those ingredients that I feel like you really introduced to me. And I think this list, I'm so glad to have this list of all the things I can do with it because I always keep tahini in my fridge and it's not a place that I genuinely turn to. And so the thought of us now having this place where we have all these ideas, but I do want to remind you of one of your other most genius moments of putting tahini paste into cookies, those tahini cookies that you made at one of our retreats that I definitely ate like well more than the share that the chef should have been eating that day. But I think in the same way that a peanut butter cookie has a richness that is different than even a butter cookie. Like there's just like something more fatty and round about it is like what you were able to achieve with these cookies that had dried fruit in them. They didn't even have any chocolate in them. They were
No.
just so rich and delicious.
Well, thank you. I mean, obviously, I didn't invent the idea of a tahini cookie, but that variation with all the dried stone fruit that you had picked up at the farmer's market, which was like dried peaches and plums and apricots, and I did a
Yeah.
mix, that with something nutty goes so well together. And I love that you brought up tahini in the fridge. Thank you. Because I store jars in the pantry unopened, but once they're open, I do like to keep it in the fridge. It just keeps it from going stale and keeps it lasting longer.
Yeah, yeah. Mine always lives in the fridge. I feel like I don't eat it fast enough, and it will
Yeah.
definitely go rancid in my pantry. Sonia, one of my next essential pantry items is farro, and it's one of those things that I think I want to credit you for, but I'm not sure. Like, I feel like we maybe sort of
No,
discovered it at the same time.
I think it was gaining popularity around the same time, and you and I both gravitated to it because we love grains. And this is like a whole chewy grain that's just so delicious.
You really took the words right out of my mouth. It's like so it is that I love the texture of it. I love the nuttiness of it. I think in place of rice, like in a bowl with vegetables, like it makes it so much more exciting. But really just boiling farro and using it in different recipes. You can put it into soups, you can put it into salads. One of my favorite salads is this Charlie Bird farro salad, which is like a mix of like herbs and vegetables and grain, the farro, and it's great for like a potluck or a picnic because it can sit for a long time. And I I'm telling you, every time I make it, someone asks me for the recipe, which I think is awesome. Um, and one of the things that makes that recipe amazing is that you cook the farro in water with a lot of vinegar, which really flavors it even more differently, which I
Well,
think is adds a great element of taste.
that's the tip you taught me. That is something
Mhm.
I learned from you from this recipe, which is so the way you cook farro, you can do it different ways, but the easiest way is to just bring water to a boil, liquid to a boil, and add your farro and then cook
Like
it till it's
pasta.
tender,
Yeah.
like pasta. And you're like, Sonia, add like a whole cup of apple cider vinegar to the water, and it adds such a nice tang to that grain that's so good for a salad.
Yeah, it really helps instead of just giving oomph to the salad, it really like is an ingredient that then holds its own. So, but I also feel like it's one of those grains that, also works really well in a soup. And like if you put rice in a soup, like it'll get super, super soft. And the farro really holds its shape, I think, in a way that a lot of other grains like it's more like barley, like it'll really hold its shape. And so I love that recipe from Six Seasons. It's like a caramelized cabbage soup with farro and parmesan. It's such like a elemental winter soup recipe, but the farro just adds so much heft to it.
That's one of my favorite uses of farro is that Joshua McFadden and Martha Holmberg recipe. It's just like cabbage farro and parmesan in stock. It's a very simple soup and it's so much better than the sum of its parts. I also love farro, and we'll talk about this a little more when I bring up a different pantry item, but you know how I love like a one pot dish, a one pan dish, a baked dish. Farro is a great grain for those kinds of like one pot, bake it in the oven, complete
Yeah.
meals. There's a couple recipes that include cauliflower. I feel like I I do a version of a farro salad like you, and I always do it with roasted cauliflower, which I can link to, like a roasted cauliflower, farro cooked with the vinegar, and then maybe some grilled lemon or lemony dressing, just something very flavorful. I love
Oh, I love
that.
that.
I love that more for the summer. In the winter, I love to do cauliflower and farro and bake it. And Smitten Kitchen actually has a great sort of like cheesy farro cauliflower bake. And I just think it's the kind of thing where you can take the farro, the whole grain, and you stick it in your casserole dish with your meat or your vegetable or your cheese, and then you add some liquid, you cover it and stick it in the oven. You don't have to pre-cook that farro. It's not like lasagna where you have to boil off sheets of pasta. It's really like a dump everything together, stick it in, and forget about it.
Yeah, and I do find it to be more forgiving than rice because there's a really big range of when it's kind of cooked. Like, it can be super chewy and like have this great, sort of chew to it. And then it can also become really soft and comforting. And I think anything in that range, like you're happy to have.
Yeah, it's so much more toothsome. And I think that's why we both love it. We're both like kind
Yeah.
of into that texture. And to go like in the same direction, but a little different. I always keep orzo, specifically orzo pasta. We could talk about all the pastas. That's a whole other conversation. But orzo, I'm like kind of treating as its own pantry ingredient. And I think about it differently from other pastas. I think about it more like farro or rice, and I use it more like that. So just like the farro, I'm using it a lot in kind of one pan dishes. And there's a couple that I really love. There are recipes that I've used as the base for sort of riffing on for myself. But like the farro, you can take raw orzo, stick it in a skillet or casserole dish, add your other ingredients, your proteins and your vegetables, add some liquid, put a lid on it, and cook it without having to separately boil it. So I just love that, right? Like it's such a hack. There's this great recipe for this one pan garlic butter chicken orzo bake
Oh my gosh, that sounds so good.
which is like pieces of sort of browned chicken, I believe is chicken thigh. And then you're adding the orzo and you're adding tons of garlic. And if you didn't want butter, you could do a non-dairy butter and you're adding a little liquid and you put a lid on it.
Is there any vegetable in there? Like you could put some greens in there,
You could
couldn't
put
you?
some, I feel like at the end of any of these, you could just stick a bag of spinach on top, put the lid on it, wilt it at the
Five
last
minutes.
minute, and then
Yeah,
you have greens now added to your one pan
right.
dish. I also saw this great recipe, which I'll share, which is for a one pan orzo and salmon. And I love the idea of that too, because it's so nice to like have your salmon cook already with the grain. And that's a complete meal.
I mean, this is another one of those ingredients that I think I would maybe put orzo in soup sometimes when I was a personal chef. Like, but
Yeah.
I sort of fell out of the routine of that. And I will say, like, I bought a box of orzo. It's sitting in my pantry. Because you're always talking about these like baked orzo dishes. And it's a place that I haven't quite gotten to yet. It's like I've sourced the ingredient and now I need this list of, I need this list of ways to cook with it. Um, but I have a similar, grain that I want to add to as well, which is couscous. And what I really mean is the couscous, but that's a little bit finer than like the pearl couscous that you know. It's more like the texture of bulgur wheat. And I used to make this couscous recipe from Barefoot Contessa. It was a really great side dish, and it all happens in the same pan, which I really loved. So in a dry skillet, you toast some pine nuts, and then and you really, by the way, this is also where I learned how finicky pine nuts can be because I've definitely have burned them many times. So this is like keep your eye on the pine nuts, toast the pine nuts, pull them out, add some butter, some shallots, get them soft, add chicken broth, add your couscous and put the lid on and let it steam for like 5 minutes. It literally takes 5 minutes of hot liquid and it steams up just like rice. And so then you take the top off, and then you can add like a flurry of herbs. I think she also calls for like dried currants, which is kind of like this nice, like savory and sweet mixture. And I made that for so many different like roast chicken dishes, rice, fish dishes, like lamb dishes. It's a great side dish. But I also started making a breakfast version of this.
Oh, cool. And what do you add to that?
So you just fluff up the grains. I like to add some cinnamon, some honey, a little bit of nutmeg. That's really nice. But in this case too, you want to like if you have any kind of dried fruit that you have on hand. I typically stick with the two that, I stick with the pine nuts and the currants, but you could also do like almonds and dried cherries. And you can serve this like a breakfast pilaf, but you can also serve it like you can add like a little bit of cream or soy milk or any of those things. And it's basically like an alternative to oatmeal.
I love that as an alternative to oatmeal. Never thought of couscous for breakfast. I do love, unlike farro and orzo, couscous fluffs up in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. It's like the quickest side you could ever make. So I'm so glad you reminded me of that because I have some couscous in my pantry, but it's not the first thing I reach for. And this inspires me to make a batch for like a side for a simple dinner one night. So I have an item that I'm not sure that you always have on hand, but like is also another sort of get out of jail free dinner card that I play a lot, which are Japanese curry cubes.
I have heard you talk about them and I used them once and I would love to go back to them because I feel like every time you describe these dishes, I'm like, I wish I was eating that for dinner.
So the box of Japanese curry will actually give you the recipe, and that is truly how I learned to make it. But I'm also going to link this amazing food blogger who really breaks down Japanese curries and suggests certain brands and tells you how to make it. And what I love about a Japanese curry cube is you can make a totally vegan or vegetarian curry, or you can make it with chicken or beef. The traditional like combo of vegetables is something like potato, onion, and carrot. Those are like the base. And then some people add like a chicken thigh. But it's so simple. It's like the package will tell you, like you saute your onion and carrot and potato, then you add water, then you put a lid on it, you steam it, and then at the very end, for like the last 5 to 10 minutes, you add the curry cube. And that over rice is so savory. And this is a 30-minute meal for me. Like the rice takes 20, the curry takes 20 or less. It all comes together really fast. I can add some protein or not add some protein. But it's just knowing that those cubes are sitting in my pantry waiting for me to be stumped on a Tuesday it just makes my life easier. So I feel like if you've never tried a Japanese curry, it is different than an Indian or Thai curry. It has that curry powder flavor with the turmeric and, sort of warming spices like clove and cinnamon. It has like notes of that, but it's not quite as spicy or as chili forward or even as complex as Indian curry can be. It's more like brown and deep and toasty in flavor.
Well, I think when you're saying that it's toasty in flavor, so I went off on a tangent at one point and I did make my own cubes and I never cooked with them, which is also kind of embarrassing. But where that toasty flavor comes from is that I think the basis of it is a roux. So
Yeah.
it's like toasted, it's that toasted oil, flour, that's what blooms all of those spices. So, Sonia, speaking of roux, that is something I keep on hand in my pantry. There are prepared jars of roux that you can buy and have in your pantry, and that's not something I grew up with. So, you know, just to kind of let everyone know if you don't know what a roux is basically like a bechamel or a white sauce, but instead of being made with dairy, like but with milk or cream, it's just oil, usually canola oil, and you cook flour in oil until it turns different shades of brown. And a deep roux that you would use it's always the basis of gumbo and a lot of different Cajun dishes. A dark roux like that is usually like the color of like a dark chocolate. Like it's you and that can take up to an hour to make. So my
Yeah, I
friend
think I never knew about jarred roux until you told me about it. I like literally didn't know it exists. I know that roux are the basis of bechamel sauces and gumbos, and it's like a thickening agent. It's fat and flour, and
Yeah.
it can be butter or oil or whatever. But I also know that it takes a full hour to get a true Cajun style roux going. So this blew my mind.
Well, a friend of mine is like she's a big Cajun cook. Her husband is a big Cajun cook. He has a blog. They're some of the most incredible cooks I've ever known in my life. And they started to manufacture this roux. And so she sent me a jar. And I have to say, as someone who didn't grow up cooking at all with something like this, I find so many places that I can add this roux. And it just sits in it's like you just get a little scoop of it and put it into like a soup, into a gravy. I put that into like my meatball gravy. I put that into my pork chop gravy. I put that into even a lentil soup that I'm like, this just needs something. You add like a little scoop of roux, it just adds this like toasty richness in the same way that we were sort of talking about like coconut milk, like rounding everything out. It's like a secret weapon in my fridge for sure.
So you're adding it like at any stage, like you could add it to a simmering pot or something, or do you have to add it when you're sauteing your vegetables?
No, I usually add it at the end because it's already
Oh,
cooked. And so it's like if I get to a place where I'm like I'll make this very savory meatball gravy, not with tomatoes, like a different kind of like savory gravy. And once I get it all finished, then I add the roux to the end and let it melt in and sort of stir it in. And it's just one of those, it's like adding bouillon a little bit. It's like it sort
oh,
of has the same effect as like adding bouillon at the end.
so interesting. I've never had this in my pantry, and it's such a smart idea. I have to try some. I have just one last quick one I have to share because I can't talk about a pantry without sharing this last item, which is pomegranate molasses. I currently have like 4 jars of it or 4 bottles of it in my pantry. I really love it in so many places as just like a vinegar or something that has a lot of acidity. It adds that brightness to dish, but it's different because it has a molassesy,
Hmm.
caramelly flavor, and it also has tang and also has a fruitiness. So I add it all the time to my salad dressings. Back to interesting salad dressings. In place of vinegar, I'll do pomegranate molasses, and then everyone is always like, "What's in
What
this
is this?
dressing?"
I know. Yes.
And then, like you taught me, I drizzle it on kabocha squash, roasted kabocha squash. That's perfect. I drizzle it on baked chicken wings. That's amazing.
Oh, wow. I've
So,
never done that.
oh, chicken and pomegranate molasses is a match made in heaven. So, I just can't end this conversation without a shout out to that.
I really love that. Well, Sonia, I will say this has been really fun. I feel like we also haven't covered like all the things that we want to cover, so we might have to do another episode of this because there are so many great pantry items that you can cook with, and I would be curious to hear like what our listeners think we've forgotten or what's something that you feel like is an essential pantry item that we did not cover today.
Yeah, we'd love to hear if there's pantry items we haven't mentioned that you have to have on hand. Obviously, we excluded the basics like flour, spices, oils, vinegars. There's so much to talk about. So we're just, doing a sort of best of list. But if you have any ideas, leave us a comment on our Substack. We send out Substacks every Wednesday with roundups from the episodes that we release on Tuesday. And you can comment right there. And you can also get all the recipes we're sharing right in your inbox. So you can always go back and find what you need.
Well, I'm going to be using this list of all these great ideas for my tahini, for my pomegranate molasses, for my orzo, all these things that I buy because I hear you talk about them and that I don't know what to do with them. So I'm thrilled to now have this list.
And now I get to try jarred roux and awaken my couscous that's sitting in my pantry that I forgot
Awaken your
about.
couscous. I love that. Until next time.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for being our food friend.
If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode with friends. We love hearing from you, so follow us on Instagram or drop us a line at foodfriendspodcast.com.
Yes, we'd love to hear from you and your food friends. Happy cooking and eating.